The night air outside Liberty General Hospital was still, the moonlight casting pale reflections on the sleek, glass-paneled exterior of the building. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beep of monitors provided a constant backdrop to the controlled chaos of the emergency department. But on the fifth floor, where Sarah Carter worked her long nursing shifts, the pace had slowed to a quiet lull as the clock approached midnight. Emily Carter sat curled up in the break room, a worn sketchbook balanced on her lap. At 13, she was no stranger to these late nights at the hospital. With her mom's erratic schedule, Emily often spent her evenings in the hospital's small staff lounge, sketching or reading while waiting for her mom to clock out. Tonight was no different, or so it seemed. Emily's pencil moved lightly over the paper, shaping the curves of a flower she'd seen earlier in the hospital courtyard. She paused, biting her lip in concentration, when the muffled sound of wheels rolling down the hallway caught her attention. Glancing up, she noticed a group of men in dark uniforms pushing large carts stacked with sealed boxes. The men weren't unusual. Deliveries came in at all hours of the day, but something about them felt off. Their movements were hurried, their faces grim, and none of them made eye contact with the nurses or staff they passed. One of them looked over his shoulder, scanning the hallway as if expecting someone to confront him. Emily tilted her head, curiosity sparked. She slipped quietly from the break room, staying out of sight as she followed the men down the corridor. They stopped at the door to the oncology wing, an area that had been closed for renovations for nearly 6 months. The lead man swiped a keycard and pushed open the door, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. One by one, they wheeled their carts inside. Emily crouched behind a corner, heart pounding. What are they doing in a closed wing of the hospital? She peeked around just in time to see the heavy door swing shut, sealing off the mysterious activity inside. She didn't linger. The last thing she wanted was to be caught snooping. Back in the break room, Emily resumed her sketching, though her mind was far from the delicate lines on the page. A little while later, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" Emily nodded, slipping her sketchbook into her bag as she stood. The two walked down the hallway toward the elevator, Sarah asking about Emily's evening in her usual warm tone. Emily hesitated, debating whether to mention what she'd seen. "Hey, Mom," she started cautiously. "Do you know why the oncology wing is still closed? I thought the renovations were supposed to be finished by now." Sarah frowned slightly. "Budget issues, I think. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Emily said quickly. "Just curious." Sarah seemed satisfied with the answer, but Emily noticed her mom's grip on her bag tighten ever so slightly. A small detail, but enough to set Emily's imagination racing. On the drive home, Emily stared out the car window, replaying the evening's events in her mind. She was used to the rhythms of hospital life, the bustle of the ER, the quiet efficiency of the night shift staff. But tonight, there had been an undercurrent of something unusual, something secretive. The next day at school, Emily found herself distracted. Her math teacher's voice faded into the background as she doodled in the margins of her notebook, sketching one of the delivery men she'd seen the night before. His face was rough, with a jagged scar along his cheek, and he had a habit of glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. She added a few other details, a badge clipped to his uniform, the logo on the crates they'd been moving. By the time she got home, her curiosity had grown into a quiet resolve. As soon as dinner was over, she retreated to her room, pulling out her sketchbook and laptop. She searched for anything she could find about the company listed on the crates, MedTech Logistics. Most of what came up seemed ordinary, shipping contracts, medical supply deals. But there were a few mentions of questionable business practices, including fines for mislabeled shipments. Emily leaned back in her chair, chewing on the end of her pencil. Something didn't add up. Why would a major company risk using a hospital to store or move goods in secret? And what was so important that it had to be hidden in a closed wing? That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep, a strange mixture of excitement and unease settled over her. She didn't know what she'd stumbled onto, but she had a feeling it was more than just hospital supplies. The men in the hallway, the unmarked crates, the closed wing. They were puzzle pieces, and Emily was determined to fit them together. Emily Carter was not one to let mysteries rest. The events of the previous night had planted a seed of curiosity in her mind, one that grew with every passing hour. By the time Sarah dropped her off at Liberty General's break room for another evening, Emily was ready to dig deeper. The break room was quiet as usual, the hum of vending machines filling the space. Emily unpacked her sketchbook and a bag of chips, but her focus was on the hospital's hallways. She waited for the night to settle, for the comforting rhythm of footsteps and beeping monitors to fade into the background. Then, just like the night before, the sound of rolling carts caught her attention. She peeked out the door. The same group of men was back, dressed in plain dark uniforms and pushing carts stacked with identical sealed boxes. This time, Emily noticed they weren't heading toward the oncology wing. Instead, they turned toward a service elevator at the end of the corridor. Curiosity burned in her chest. Emily slipped her sketchbook into her bag and followed at a distance, staying close to the wall to avoid being seen. She watched as the men wheeled the carts into the elevator and pressed a button. The doors slid shut, leaving her staring at the glowing numbers on the panel. Emily wandered back toward the main floor, unsure of what to do next. That's when she noticed the hospital's security office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside she could see a bank of monitors displaying live footage of every corner of the hospital, including the service elevator. She hesitated, her heart pounding. This is probably off-limits, she thought, but her feet moved before she could stop herself. She slipped into the room and scanned the screens, quickly locating the camera feed from the service elevator. The men had reached the basement, a part of the hospital Emily had never explored. They were unloading the boxes into a dimly lit room. On another screen, she saw a large steel door marked Storage A. One of the men used a keycard to unlock it, revealing rows of shelves. They stacked the crates on the shelves and exited without a word. Emily scribbled down the time and the label on the door, Storage A. Just as she finished, a voice startled her. "You're not supposed to be in here." She spun around to see Dr. Logan West, one of the hospital's attending physicians. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. I got lost," Emily stammered, clutching her notebook. Drive West's gaze lingered on her for a moment, then softened. "The staff lounge is down the hall. You should go back there. It's not safe for you to wander around." Emily nodded quickly and slipped past him, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She could feel his eyes on her as she walked away. Later that night, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, reviewing her notes. She had written down the license plate of the van she'd seen, the time of the delivery, and the label on the steel door. She flipped through her sketchbook, adding details to her drawings of the delivery men. Each face became sharper, more familiar, as if she were committing them to memory. When Mark returned home from a long day at work, Emily wasted no time sharing what she'd found. She showed him her sketches and explained what she'd seen in the security office. "They're storing those crates in a locked room in the basement," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nerves. "Doesn't that seem weird to you?" Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's definitely unusual," he admitted, "but we need to be careful. If these guys are up to no good, they won't appreciate being spied on." Emily nodded, though her curiosity remained undeterred. "Do you think we should tell someone?" she asked. "Not yet," Mark replied. "We don't have enough to go on, but I'll see what I can dig up about the hospital's operations. In the meantime, promise me you'll stay out of this." Emily hesitated, but eventually agreed. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The next day, Mark began his own investigation. He pulled up records on MedTech Logistics, the company name Emily had seen on the crates. What he found wasn't encouraging. The company had a history of financial irregularities and ties to smaller firms suspected of smuggling contraband. He also discovered that Storage A wasn't listed on any of the hospital's public floor plans. That evening, Mark shared his findings with Sarah. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence. "Hospitals deal with all kinds of vendors," she said. "It doesn't mean anything shady is going on." But when Mark mentioned the unlisted storage room, Sarah's expression changed. "That's strange," she admitted. "I've been working here for years, and I've never heard of Storage A." Meanwhile, Emily was busy noticing other oddities. During her next visit to the hospital, she observed that the same delivery crew always showed up at night, never interacting with the regular staff. Their uniforms didn't have any logos, and they avoided speaking to anyone unless absolutely necessary. One night, while Sarah worked a double shift, Emily wandered the halls with her sketchbook, pretending to draw flowers in the waiting area. She saw the delivery crew heading toward the service elevator again and decided to follow. This time, she stayed far enough back to avoid being noticed. She watched them enter the elevator, then returned to the break room. But instead of sketching, she pulled out her phone and began searching for blueprints of Liberty General Hospital. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The basement floor wasn't supposed to have a storage A. Emily's mind raced. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she was certain it wasn't legal. And if the hospital was involved, who could she trust? The mystery was deepening, and Emily felt like she was the only one with the courage to face it head-on. Mark Carter had a hard time sleeping that night. The quiet suburban street outside their house seemed peaceful, but in his mind, he was piecing together the troubling discoveries Emily had made. The unmarked crates, the suspicious deliveries, and the secret storage room. It all pointed to something much bigger than hospital logistics. At the breakfast table the next morning, Emily sat across from her father, watching him scroll through pages of data on his laptop. She could tell he was deep in thought, his brows furrowed and his coffee untouched. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tentative but eager. Mark nodded slowly. "The company behind those crates, MedTech Logistics, has a history of shady dealings. Financial records show fines for mislabeled shipments and connections to smaller firms suspected of smuggling contraband. It's no smoking gun, but it's enough to raise red flags." Emily leaned forward. "So what do we do now?" Mark met her eyes. "We keep digging, but we have to be careful. If these people are moving illegal goods through the hospital, they won't hesitate to protect their operation. I don't want you putting yourself in danger. Promise me that." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." That evening, Mark took his investigation a step further. He reached out to an old Navy SEAL teammate, Agent Daniel Pierce, who now worked with the FBI. The two had stayed in touch over the years, and Mark trusted him implicitly. "Dan," Mark said over the phone, "I need a favor. There's something suspicious happening at Liberty General Hospital, and I think it's connected to a larger smuggling operation. Can you run a check on a company called MedTech Logistics?" "Sure thing," Pierce replied. "Send me what you've got, and I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Mark. If this is as big as it sounds, you're dealing with dangerous people." Mark thanked him and hung up, his thoughts racing. If the FBI got involved, this could escalate quickly. But before they could act, he needed more concrete evidence. Meanwhile, Emily was unable to shake her curiosity. After school, she returned to the hospital with Sarah, slipping her sketchbook into her bag as usual. Instead of heading to the break room, she wandered the hallways, keeping her head down to avoid attracting attention. As she passed the staff lounge, she overheard two nurses talking in hushed voices. "I don't like those late-night deliveries," one said. "It feels wrong. Why are they using a closed wing for storage?" "Don't ask too many questions," the other replied nervously. "I heard Carla Bennett is involved, and you know how she gets when people poke around." Emily froze. Carla Bennett was the hospital's chief administrator, known for her no-nonsense attitude. If she was involved, this was bigger than Emily had imagined. Later that night, Mark shared his latest findings with Emily and Sarah. "Carla Bennett," he said, pacing the living room. "She's the one signing off on these deliveries. And guess what? She has financial ties to MedTech Logistics. It's subtle, shell companies and offshore accounts, but it's there." Sarah crossed her arms, her face pale. If Carla's involved, the hospital could be complicit. What if other staff members know but are too scared to speak out? Mark nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of. This isn't just about smuggling supplies. This could be a full-scale criminal operation." Emily spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "Then we have to stop them. If we don't, who will?" Mark looked at his daughter, a mixture of pride and worry in his eyes. "We will," he said firmly, "but we have to be smart about it." Over the next few days, Emily continued to observe the hospital's operations during her visits. She noticed patterns. The same van always arrived between 10:30 p.m. and midnight. The same crew unloaded the crates, and the crates always went to the same locations, either the oncology wing or the mysterious storage A. Mark, meanwhile, installed a small, discreet camera near the hospital's loading dock to capture footage of the deliveries. He stayed up late at night, reviewing the recordings and piecing together the timeline of events. One night, the camera caught something alarming. A sleek black car pulled up alongside the delivery van. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his demeanor calm and commanding. "That's Vincent Drake," Mark said, showing the footage to Sarah and Emily. "He's a known trafficker with ties to organized crime. If he's involved, this is bigger than I thought." Emily stared at the screen, her stomach tightening. She recognized Drake from one of her sketches. He had been at the hospital during one of the late-night deliveries. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means we're dealing with a network," Mark replied grimly. "Smuggling weapons, drugs, who knows what else. And they're using the hospital as a cover." The tension in the Carter household grew. Mark stayed out late, meeting with Pierce and gathering evidence. Sarah, though supportive, worried about the danger they were putting themselves in. And Emily, despite her promise to stay out of it, couldn't help but feel like she was in too deep to stop now. One evening, while reviewing footage from the loading dock, Mark spotted something chilling. One of Vincent Drake's men was holding a clipboard with a list of names. At the top of the list was Sarah Carter. "They know about us," Mark said, his voice low. "They've been watching." Emily's heart raced. "What do we do?" "We stay vigilant," Mark said, "and we keep gathering evidence. But we need to move fast. They're on to us." The air in the Carter household was thick with unease. Mark, Sarah, and Emily had always been close, but the tension of their newfound situation weighed heavily on them. Mark spent hours in his study, mapping out connections and reviewing the evidence they'd gathered, while Sarah made efforts to appear normal at work, keeping her family's investigation a secret. Emily, despite her father's warnings, couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. The night started like any other. Emily sat in the hospital's break room with her sketchbook while Sarah worked her shift. She tried to focus on drawing, but her mind was on the sleek black car and the clipboard they'd seen on the surveillance footage. The thought of her mom's name on that list sent a chill down her spine. At 10:45 p.m., the now familiar sound of carts rolling through the hallways caught her attention. Emily peeked out of the break room door and saw the same delivery crew heading toward the service elevator. This time, something felt different. The men moved with even more urgency, and one of them kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to intervene. Emily's instincts kicked in. She waited for them to disappear into the elevator, then slipped into the stairwell, descending toward the basement. Her heart pounded as she crept down the dimly lit corridor, careful to stay out of sight. When she reached the basement, she saw the men wheeling the crates into storage A. The steel door stood ajar, revealing shelves lined with more of the identical boxes. Emily crouched behind a stack of old equipment, her phone in hand. She snapped a few photos, trying to steady her trembling hands. Just as she was about to retreat, a voice echoed down the hallway. "Hey, who's there?" Emily froze, her heart racing. She stuffed her phone into her pocket and darted back toward the stairwell, her sneakers barely making a sound on the cold tile floor. When she returned to the break room, her pulse was still pounding. She tried to act casual as Sarah walked in, her face lined with exhaustion from a busy shift. "You okay, honey?" Sarah asked, noticing Emily's flushed cheeks. "Yeah, just tired," Emily replied, forcing a smile. But Sarah's intuition told her something was wrong. Later that night, when they returned home, she cornered Emily in her room. "What happened tonight?" Sarah asked, her tone firm but concerned. Emily hesitated, then told her mom everything. The photos, the deliveries, and the close call in the basement. Sarah's face turned pale. "Emily, do you realize how dangerous this is? These people are criminals. If they catch you—" "I know," Emily interrupted, her voice shaking. "But we can't just ignore this, Mom. They're using your hospital to do something terrible." Sarah sighed, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "You're brave, Emily, but please leave this to your father. Promise me you'll stay out of it from now on." Meanwhile, Mark's investigation was reaching a critical point. He had compiled enough evidence to confirm that MedTech Logistics was smuggling military-grade weapons through the hospital. His contact, Agent Pierce, had been quietly assembling a task force to take down the operation, but they needed one more piece of the puzzle, proof of Vincent Drake's direct involvement. The next night, Mark stationed himself near the hospital's loading dock, his camera set to record. He had warned Sarah and Emily to stay home, but Emily couldn't resist sneaking a look at the footage once he returned. The camera captured Vincent Drake arriving in his sleek black car, just as he had on previous nights. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Another man stepped out of the car, a tall, stern-looking figure in a military uniform. Mark froze the footage and zoomed in on the man's face. "General Michael Beck," he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Emily looked at her dad, confused. "Who's that?" Mark's expression darkened. "A decorated officer with ties to military contractors. If he's involved, this operation isn't just criminal, it's a threat to national security." The stakes had never been higher, and Mark knew they needed to act fast. He contacted Agent Pierce, who agreed to move forward with the sting operation. The plan was simple but risky. Catch the crew in the act and apprehend Vincent Drake and his associates during the next delivery. Mark's role was to stay close, feeding real-time information to the FBI team. He instructed Emily and Sarah to stay home, but deep down, he knew his daughter wouldn't sit idly by. On the night of the sting, Emily stayed up late, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She knew her dad was at the hospital, and the thought of him facing those dangerous men alone made her stomach churn. Around midnight, she received a text from her dad. "Everything's set. Stay put." But Emily's gut told her something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the fear that her dad was walking into a trap. Without thinking, she grabbed her sketchbook and snuck out of the house, heading for the hospital. When she arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Unmarked FBI vehicles were stationed discreetly around the perimeter, and the usual hum of hospital activity was replaced by an eerie stillness. Emily hid near the loading dock, her heart pounding as she watched the crew unload another round of crates. Vincent Drake stepped out of his car, barking orders to his men. General Beck stood beside him, his arms crossed, exuding authority. Emily spotted her dad in the shadows, his phone to his ear as he relayed information to the FBI. She stayed hidden, watching as the FBI agents moved into position. But just as the agents prepared to make their move, one of Drake's men shouted, "It's a setup." Chaos erupted. Drake's men drew their weapons, and the FBI team stormed in, shouting commands. Emily ducked behind a stack of crates, her heart racing. She saw her dad rush toward one of the agents, helping him subdue a fleeing suspect. In the commotion, Vincent Drake and General Beck slipped away, retreating toward the service elevator. Emily's eyes widened. Without thinking, she followed, staying far enough back to avoid being seen. The elevator doors closed just as she reached them, but Emily wasn't deterred. She sprinted toward the stairwell, determined to catch up. Emily's feet pounded against the cold stairwell floor as she ascended toward the hospital's rooftop. The echoes of shouts and footsteps from the FBI's sting operation reverberated below, but her focus was on catching Vincent Drake and General Beck. When she reached the rooftop door, she pressed her ear against it, hearing muffled voices. Slowly, she pushed it open just enough to peek outside. On the rooftop, Drake stood by a sleek helicopter, its blades whirring as it prepared for takeoff. General Beck was beside him, barking orders into a radio. Two men stood nearby, their hands on their holstered weapons. Emily's heart raced. She couldn't let them escape. She fumbled for her phone and quickly texted her dad. On the roof, Drake and Beck trying to escape by helicopter. She crouched behind a vent, praying that her message had gone through. Meanwhile, on the ground, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his blood running cold when he saw Emily's text. "Pierce," he shouted to the FBI agent in charge. "They're on the roof." Agent Pierce barked orders into his radio, redirecting agents to the stairwell and calling for aerial support. "Where's Emily?" Pierce asked, noticing the panic on Mark's face. "She's up there," Mark replied, already running toward the stairwell. Back on the rooftop, Emily watched as Drake and Beck argued. "This operation is blown. Beck snapped, his voice cutting through the wind. We need to get out of here before they take us down. Drake shook his head. We're not leaving until we secure the files. Without them, this entire network collapses. Emily realized they were talking about evidence, files that could expose the full extent of their operation. She knew she had to delay them somehow. Summoning her courage, she stepped out from behind the vent. You're not going anywhere, she shouted, her voice shaking but loud enough to make the men turn. Drake's eyes narrowed as he spotted her. Who's this? Another nosy kid? Beck gestured to his men. Get rid of her. The two armed men advanced toward Emily, but before they could reach her, a loud voice boomed across the rooftop. Stop right there. Mark burst onto the scene, his pistol drawn and aimed squarely at the two henchmen. Behind him, several FBI agents emerged, weapons at the ready. Drop your weapons, Pierce ordered, his voice commanding. The henchmen hesitated, glancing at Drake and Beck. Seeing no way out, they reluctantly raised their hands. Drake's face twisted into a sneer. This isn't over, he hissed, turning toward the helicopter. But before he could climb aboard, Emily grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it at the helicopter's controls. The heavy metal cylinder smashed against the dashboard, sending sparks flying. The pilot shouted in alarm, shutting down the engine as smoke billowed from the cockpit. You little, Drake snarled, advancing on Emily. Mark stepped between them, his stance steady. You're done, Drake. Give it up. Drake glanced at Beck, who looked equally defeated. With no escape and FBI agents closing in, the two men raised their hands in surrender. The rooftop was secured within minutes, and Drake and Beck were handcuffed and escorted away by the FBI. Emily stood beside her dad, her legs trembling as the adrenaline wore off. What were you thinking? Mark asked, his voice a mix of relief and exasperation. I couldn't let them get away, Emily said, her voice small. Mark sighed, pulling her into a tight hug. You scared me half to death, kiddo, but you were brave. Reckless, but brave. Over the next several hours, the FBI combed through the hospital, arresting members of Drake's crew and seizing the crates of weapons. The files Drake and Beck had been so desperate to retrieve were recovered from a hidden compartment in the storage room. The documents detailed an elaborate smuggling network that spanned multiple states and involved high-ranking officials. Agent Pierce approached the Carters in the early morning light, his expression grim but satisfied. We've got enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, he said. Drake, Beck, and their associates won't see daylight for a long time. Mark nodded. What about the hospital? The administration is cooperating, Pierce replied. They claim they didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but will be conducting a thorough investigation. Carla Bennett is already in custody. As dawn broke over Liberty General, the hospital began to stir with its usual activity. Nurses and doctors went about their routines, seemingly unaware of the drama that had unfolded just hours earlier. Emily sat in the break room with her mom, sipping a cup of hot cocoa as Sarah fussed over her. You're grounded for a month, Sarah said, her voice stern but full of love. I know, Emily replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. And no more sneaking around, Sarah added. Promise me. I promise, Emily said, though her tone suggested she might not entirely mean it. Mark entered the room, looking tired but proud. The FBI wants to thank you, Emily, he said. Your quick thinking helped stop something truly dangerous. Emily beamed. I just did what I thought was right. That evening, as the family returned home, they felt a sense of relief they hadn't experienced in weeks. The shadows that had loomed over them were finally lifting. But Emily knew she'd never forget what had happened, or the lesson she'd learned. Courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up for what was right, even when fear threatened to overwhelm you. The weeks following the sting operation were a whirlwind for the Carter family. The FBI had dismantled the smuggling network operating out of Liberty General Hospital, and arrests were being made across the country. Headlines splashed the names of Vincent Drake, General Michael Beck, and other high-profile figures involved in the conspiracy. For Emily, life hadn't quite returned to normal. The excitement of the rooftop showdown had given way to a mix of pride and unease. While she was glad to have helped, the danger her family had faced lingered in her mind. At breakfast one morning, Mark set down his newspaper, a rare smile on his face. "They got Carla Bennett to talk," he said. Sarah looked up from her coffee. "What did she say?" "She confirmed everything," Mark replied. The smuggling operation had been running for nearly a year. MedTech Logistics provided cover for illegal shipments, and they used the hospital's closed wings to store the goods temporarily. Beck and Drake were running the show, with Bennett ensuring no one on staff asked questions. Emily listened quietly, her hands wrapped around her mug of cocoa. "What's going to happen to them?" she asked. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Drake and Beck are facing federal charges, including smuggling, conspiracy, and corruption. Bennett's cooperating, so her sentence will probably be lighter, but she'll never work in healthcare again. The rest of their network is crumbling too." Sarah let out a sigh of relief. "Good. The hospital needs to heal, and the staff deserves better than this mess." Emily accompanied her mom to Liberty General later that day. The hospital was buzzing, but not with fear or suspicion as before. Instead, there was a sense of hope. The staff knew the worst was behind them, and changes were already underway. Emily watched as Sarah spoke with her colleagues, offering words of encouragement. Dr. Logan West, who had always seemed aloof, approached Emily with a warm smile. "You've got guts, kid," he said. "What you did took courage. I'm glad you're on our side." Emily blushed, not used to such direct praise. "I just wanted to help," she said modestly. "Well, you did more than that," Logan replied. "The hospital owes you and your family a debt we can't repay." Later that week, the FBI invited the Carters to a press conference. Agent Daniel Pierce stood at the podium, flanked by local law enforcement and federal officials. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as Pierce detailed the operation. "This case demonstrates the power of vigilance and courage," Pierce said. "Thanks to the brave efforts of Mark Carter and his family, we were able to uncover a sophisticated smuggling network and bring those responsible to justice." Emily squirmed slightly in her seat as the cameras turned toward her. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she couldn't help feeling a swell of pride. After the conference, Mark pulled Emily aside. "You know," he said, "I wasn't thrilled about you sneaking around during all this, but I have to admit, you've got a knack for spotting what others miss. That's a rare gift." Emily smiled up at her dad. "I learned from the best." Mark chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Just don't go chasing any more criminals without backup, okay?" "Deal," Emily said, grinning. As life began to settle down, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She'd seen firsthand how greed and corruption could put innocent people in danger, but she'd also learned how determination and teamwork could make a difference. Inspired by her experience, Emily started a blog to share her story. She wrote about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary, and encouraged others to pay attention to the world around them. Her posts quickly gained traction, with readers praising her bravery and insight. At Liberty General, the changes were tangible. The hospital administration was overhauled, and new policies were put in place to ensure transparency and accountability. The staff worked hard to restore trust with the community, and Sarah took on a leadership role in advocating for ethical practices in healthcare. Mark, meanwhile, used his experience to start a nonprofit focused on exposing corruption in local institutions. He worked closely with law enforcement and other veterans, helping communities root out wrongdoing and rebuild with integrity. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Emily turned to her parents with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever have another adventure like this?" she asked. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Let's hope not. I think we've had enough excitement to last a lifetime." Sarah laughed, pulling Emily into a hug. "But if we do, we'll face it together. That's what matters." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. No matter what the future held, she knew she could count on her family to stand by her side, and she'd do the same for them. The Carter household had returned to a sense of calm in the weeks after the press conference. While life was no longer consumed by surveillance footage, shadowy figures, or late-night plotting, the events at Liberty General left an indelible mark on the family. Their shared experience had strengthened their bond, and the lessons learned stayed with them. One sunny afternoon, Emily sat at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop. Her blog, Small Steps for Big Change, had taken off, drawing readers from across the country. She wrote about her experience in the hospital, carefully omitting sensitive details, and shared lessons about courage, curiosity, and standing up for justice. Her latest post ended with a simple message. Courage isn't about having no fear. It's about taking action despite your fear, knowing that what you're doing is right. Even the smallest voices can create ripples that change the world. Satisfied, Emily hit publish and leaned back in her chair, smiling as notifications of new readers and comments popped up on her screen. Downstairs, Mark was reviewing plans for his newly launched nonprofit, Clear Path Initiative. Focused on exposing corruption and strengthening accountability in local institutions, the organization had already made an impact. Mark had spoken at several community events, sharing his insights from the Liberty General case, and had partnered with law enforcement to offer training in recognizing red flags. As he flipped through files, Sarah walked in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Still working," she teased, setting one mug down in front of him. Mark grinned. "Just trying to make sure our next adventure doesn't find us unprepared." Sarah laughed, sitting beside him. "Let's hope there's no next time. But if there is, I'm glad we have each other." Mark reached for her hand. "Always." That evening, the family gathered in the backyard. The sunset painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Emily had set up a small telescope, eager to show her parents the constellations she'd learned about in school. As they took turns peering at the stars, Emily turned to her parents, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think things are really better now? At the hospital, I mean?" Sarah nodded. "They are. It'll take time to rebuild trust, but the staff is determined to make it a safe, honest place again. People want to do the right thing. They just need the chance." Mark chimed in. "And people like you, Emily. You didn't just see something wrong. You acted on it. That's what makes change possible." Emily smiled, feeling a swell of pride. I guess it wasn't such a small thing after all. As the night deepened, Emily stared up at the vast sky, her heart full of gratitude and resolve. She thought about the journey her family had been on, the risks they'd taken, and the impact they'd made. She realized that while their adventure had been frightening, it had also been transformative. She whispered a silent promise to herself. No matter where life took her, she would always stand up for what was right. The next morning, Emily found an email from one of her blog readers. It was from a girl her age in another state, who had noticed suspicious activity at her school and didn't know what to do. "Your blog gave me the courage to speak up," the message read. "Thank you for showing me that even small voices can make a difference." Emily's heart soared. She replied with encouragement and advice, realizing that her actions had created a ripple effect. In the months that followed, life settled into a steady rhythm. Sarah continued her work at Liberty General, now serving on a committee to ensure ethical practices in healthcare. Mark expanded Clear Path Initiative, helping communities across the country. Emily balanced school, her blog, and a growing sense of purpose. One day, as the family gathered for dinner, Emily looked around the table, her heart full. They had faced danger and uncertainty together and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, she knew they were ready.